Years ago this very day we went to Governor's Isle for to stand for instant cannon in true military style. 17 American dollars each month we surely get for to carry a gun and baguettes with a military step.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Sam Arnold for Frying Pans West, and I want to welcome you back to a show tonight on alcohols of the frontier and in the early West. As you may well imagine, trekking across those miles of vast wilderness was no easy task, and a man at the end of the day, as today, liked to have a little something to warm his body, a little toddy for the body. And of course, alcohol was a major fur trade item. In the period when the beaver hat was at its vogue and the trappers were out in the mountains of the West looking for beaver pelts, they used to take alcohol along with them to trade to the Indians in order to get furs from them, beaver pelts and other types of furs. Alcohol was a very highly prized merchandise item. They used to bring it west in the period up until the mid-1820s. Now, the government saw that alcohol was used in such profusion that it was really ruining the Indian health, so they passed legislation prohibiting alcohol to be brought west except in a very small amounts, supposedly for the use of the men going west themselves. This was abused very quickly. In the 1820s, this legislation simply allowed each man to have a small quantity. Well, Ashley's group ended up with something better than 500 gallons that they brought with them for their own use, supposedly. Actually, it was to be used to trade to the Indians. And the government, in its efforts to close off the alcohol coming west, stationed troops, inspection stations on the Missouri River and in the beginnings of all of the trails coming west. This was part of a mass temperance movement that had grown up in the 1820s because of the large amount of alcoholism in the country at that time. This was in part due to the fact that rum was readily available. It had been the original colonial drink, probably the most popular one after Arak, which was a type of rum. And then the fermented sugar cane, which they made rum from, was replaced by corn whiskey. Also rye whiskey, as grown by the Pennsylvania farmers around Pittsburgh. They used to grow rye and then turn this into whiskey, and this was part of the Whiskey Rebellion in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, back in the early 1800s. The fact was that if a man grew a lot of corn, if he wanted to take this to market, he'd have to hull the corn and put it into great huge sacks, and this was heavy, difficult to handle, and didn't bring very much in market. They'd have to travel long distances, and of course in those days their transportation was either by horse and wagon or by boat. Very heavily they used the waterways of the country, and a man found that if he took corn and had a little still, he could turn that corn into liquid and sell it for a great deal more money than just the hulled corn or in corn meal, and it was less bulky to handle, and of course you could sample a little of your own makings too as you were making it. So the consumption of alcohol in this country grew and grew until in the 20s the temperance people really got very strongly behind the movement and then turned it off. They, for example, cut down many of the apple trees that were here in this country. They decimated the apple orchards because they wanted to cut out the amount of applejack that they made. Applejack being second in popularity to rum, and then of course the corn whiskey and rye whiskey. Well, the settlers who went down into Kentucky took the technique of making corn and rye whiskey, and they began blending the two of them and putting them into charred oak barrels, and they got what they called bourbon, what we call bourbon today. Now, of course, the alcohol, when it is first distilled, as all alcohols, are almost totally clear. They're like water in appearance, and it's only with the addition of coloring that you get the colored alcohols that you know today. The term bourbon is a generic one now, spanning any type of mixture of corn and rye whiskey that has been put into charred oak barrels. But in those days, Bourbon was a county. It's today a very small county in Kentucky, but originally it was a county in Virginia, because Virginia extended all the way west into what is today Kentucky. Then when Kentucky became a state, Bourbon County was one of the largest of the counties in that state, and gradually it's been nibbled away at until other counties have been formed, and now Bourbon County is a relatively small county. And the term bourbon whiskey stems from that. Well, bourbon used to come west, but only in the latter part of the 1820s and 1830s is when you first began seeing some bourbon as such coming west. There was another whiskey called Monongahela, which was named for a river in Pennsylvania where the Pennsylvania German distillers made their rye whiskey. As I say, the government tried to turn off the whiskey coming west. Mr. Audubon has an interesting area in his diary, or section in his diary, about helping the smugglers take alcohol on up the Missouri River. He kept the guard, the head of the guard section, busy while the men were able to sneak the alcohol past the government inspection station. The government, about 1832, began to become very restive about so much alcohol slipping through, and so they turned it off completely, and it was forbidden to bring alcohol into Indian country. So, anticipating this, the trappers and some very enterprising Americans headed on down into what is now New Mexico, which was at that time Mexican territory. Well, around Taos, New Mexico, which is north of Santa Fe and just south of the Colorado border today, Taos, New Mexico became a headquarters for alcohol in the West. Now, this was contraband. It was made in an area which belonged to the Republic of Mexico, and it was made, however, by Americans, and there were some 5 distilleries operating in Taos by 1846 when the United States took that territory. They took the alcohol north out of Taos, the production, and brought it on up the South Platte into Wyoming, and then into Montana, Idaho, and the other areas where there was a lot of traffic with the Indians. Much of the alcohol was carried in cottonwood kegs that they would make. They'd take a log of cottonwood, and then they would seal it with rawhide across the top, and they would bring these cottonwood kegs up with the alcohol. In every community in America that of any size, there were potters, and one of the typical things that you saw both in the American West and in the eastern area were little brown jugs. And I brought some samplings of different ages of little brown jugs here. These aren't so little, but this is, for example, a pre-Civil War one, and it is thrown on a wheel across the bottom here. And then, if you can see, there are various layers of it. It was laid up in coils and then hand-formed up into a jug. And wherever you see this irregularity of the side surfaces, this is usually one that is pre-Civil War in period. Here is another one. It's a bit later, because they have made this much more symmetrical, and the walls are quite flat instead of having these little bands that you can see, and then there is a slight collar here, and then it comes up and is round. This is probably Civil War period. It could be just post-Civil War. Then the modern brown jug that is still made very much today has a collar on it of this sort. It comes over like that and then comes up symmetrically, and then they hand form this little handle. They take a template, and as this thing is turning, they just cut into it like a lathe, and it becomes symmetrical. Now, wines on the frontier were also quite common. Of course, wine bottles were hand-blown, and wine purveyors used to buy what they called pipes or hogsheads. Hogshead being a very large barrel, and a pipe being a half of a hogshead. These containers had all sorts of European wines. There were, for example, at Fort Vancouver in early days, they could offer you at the table a selection of both Italian and French wines. Of course, in the New Mexico area in Southern California, the priests not only brought grape shoots with them and made wines, but also there were imported wines both from Spain and France. At Bent's Fort, for example, on the Arkansas in southern Colorado in the 1834 to 1840 period, they could offer you a selection of Médoc, Saint-Julien wines, French, or wines from the Canary Islands, from Tenerife, and these are not apparently brought into this country very much anymore. They had Madeira, of course, and I was able to find an old bottle of Madeira. This is an 1848 vintage, and the whole bottle is crusted on the inside. And on the back side it says that this wine was kept and aged in oak casks until bottled in 1927 and was rebottled again in 1957, and only 450 bottles remain in existence. This is bottle number 436. Now, this is from the Madeira, the island of Madeira in the Atlantic. Much fun to drink, and it's incidentally most delicious. Now, the bottles being hand-blown in those days were subject to breaking, and so they were really only used to decant the wine into and to serve at the table. If you were operating a tavern in those days, you would buy a large keg of wine or cask of wine, and then you would perhaps get 12 or 24 bottles and a whole bunch of French labels with them, if it happened to be French wine. Although that was not necessarily always the case. In the Hotel de Paris, the museum here in Colorado, they have in the basement of it a wine cask with a spigot on it and a whole bunch of bottles, and it was wine from California. However, they had a great quantity of French labels, and they would put these labels on it when they brought the bottle up to the table. This isn't allowed these days, but it was a technique that allowed them to put whatever label they wanted onto whatever bottle. Now, champagne was not unknown in the West. In 1832, a young man came west with Sublet's group, and when they started building a fort in eastern Wyoming, which later was the site of Fort Laramie, they christened this with a bottle of French champagne. In the West also, a man by the name of McGoffin bought his way out of a Mexican prison with 3,000 bottles of French champagne. A bottle in those days was about $6. Now that was equivalent to a month's wages for one man. They would pay an average trapper, for example, $6 a month, and the champagne cost that much. There are many references to champagne in the West, and when you think of the early days, don't think of it completely as scalping, blood and guts. It had its degree of sophistication too. So I wanted to take you up today to Fort Laramie. Now, Fort Laramie is in eastern Wyoming. It is not in the town of Laramie, which is much further west, but Fort Laramie was on the North Platte, and it was a major fur trade center in the beginnings, and then later a major army post for the entire West. We went up there with a camera crew, and we took pictures of the whole reconstructed installation. We had pictures of the bathtub, the little tin bathtub. You'll see that when I'm taking my boots off in it. And many of the buildings, the new reconstructed Old Bedlam, which is the bachelor's officers' quarters. It's a beautiful new building and a new old building. It was about to fall down. But at any rate, we went up to see the historian at Fort Laramie, who's Bill Shea. Here we go. This is Bill Shea.
The original fort here at Fort Laramie wasn't a military post. It was a fur trading post, and its official name was Fort William. And it was built by two fur traders from St. Louis, William Sublette and Robert Camel, in 1834. By 1841, this Fort William had passed into the hands of the American Fur Company, which became the great monopoly outfit in the West. It decided that it would have to replace Fort William with a larger and more permanent post, so it built a fort or trading post out of adobe brick in 1841, and they named this one Fort John. However, people still continued to call both Fort William and Fort John first the fort on the Laramie Fork, and finally it got shortened and twisted to Fort Laramie. They built the big fort just as the fur trade was rapidly declining or going downhill. But as the fur trade declined, other people started traveling through here. These were not fur traders, Sam, and they weren't hunters or trappers.
They were immigrants.
They were immigrants. They were people, largely farmers from eastern states, who were going to one or two faraway countries that most Americans at that time had never heard of, either the Oregon country or the California country. Peak years of travel on the emigrant route, as they called it in those days, and the Oregon Trail, we call it today, came in 1850, 51, and 52.
How many a day used to go by the fort?
Oh, the highest number in any particular year came in 1851, when there were an estimated 52,000 people a year passed through here with their animals and their
That was
vehicles.
just summertime, so you could figure
Yes, they're roughly what we call our tourist months now, Sam.
5,000 or
oddly
6,000 a day
That's
passing right by here.
At times there was almost a continuous string of emigrant wagons from horizon to horizon as far as you could see.
Well, they must have done a lively business. What did they have, a sutler store?
Yes, they had a sutler store, and it did do a lively business.
What did they have for sale?
Well, they had a good many things. Of course, they had standard articles such as clay pipes, tobaccos, bourbon, but would you believe it? One of the biggest selling items, Sam, was peppermint stick candy.
I'll be darned. How about canned goods?
Yes, they had very wide variety of canned goods. Among these were canned oysters, caviar,
Caviar?
delicacies such as that. Oh, yes, I guess the West, Sam, wasn't quite as rugged as we like to think it is.
We're here in the Burt house. Colonel Burt was second in command at Fort Laramie, and we had gotten a hold of Elizabeth Burt's cookbook. There it is there. They have this in the museum at Fort Laramie. The Burts lived in this one house that's been refurbished, and we went in and got the recipe for baked Indian pudding and decided that we'd make it right there in the Burt's kitchen from Elizabeth Burt's own cookbook recipe. And the way you make it is to pour a quart of boiling milk over a pint of cornmeal, and then you let it stand to cool. Then you take a half pint of molasses, or enough to sweeten the pudding, and you put a tablespoon of butter with the molasses and let it melt on the stove. Then you put in 3 well-beaten eggs without separating the whites and the yolks. And you mix this well and add some grated lemon peel or raisins if you like. And you bake it slowly for an hour, and you can eat it with, as Elizabeth Burt said, eat with beaten butter and sugar. And we're right here putting the molasses into the into the eggs, the beaten eggs. If you have a pencil handy, you might take this down. It's a quart of milk and a pint of cornmeal, a half pint of molasses, a tablespoon of butter, 3 eggs, grated lemon peel, raisins, butter and sugar. That's just a tablespoon of butter. And you pour it into your bowl and throw it in the oven and bake it. It takes quite a time actually to bake, an hour she says, but we find that about an hour and a half, sometimes an hour and 45 minutes is necessary. And you can bake that at around 300, 325. It does very nicely. Now on the left is Bill Shea and then Charles Sharp, who's the superintendent of Fort Laramie. And the ladies up there in his office made Elizabeth Burt's chicken salad and also some potato bread. Now, I have the chicken salad recipe, which I'm going to give you. It's a much drier one than what one is normally accustomed to. It has a very little bit of dressing and lots of pieces of good cooked chicken. This is being eaten right in the Burt's dining room using their own service plates and cups and saucers. Now, I think I'll read to you the recipe for the chicken salad. This is a teaspoon of fine mustard, 1 egg, a teaspoon of wine or cider vinegar, 6 tablespoons of salad oil, a tablespoon of vinegar, a tablespoon of lemon juice, and 1 boiled chicken. You strip the meat off of the chicken. Celery, a couple of stalks, and a saltspoon of salt. That's about a half teaspoon. Some lettuce, or in the frontier they used cabbage in case they didn't have lettuce. Parsley, capers, olives, and hard-boiled eggs. And you mix a heaping teaspoon of fine mustard, the yolk of a fresh egg, and a teaspoon of fresh wine or cider vinegar into a smooth paste using a silver fork. Measure out 6 tablespoons of pure salad oil and 1 tablespoon each of vinegar and lemon juice. Mix it slowly, making a creamy paste. Take 1 cold-boiled chicken, remove the skin, bones, and fat, and chop it up, not too fine, sort of bite-sized pieces. Cut up an equal bulk of celery and mix with the chicken. Add a saltspoon of salt and half of the dressing. Cover the bottom of a platter with the larger leaves of lettuce, leaf lettuce, and lay in smaller green leaves around the border. Place the salad in the dish and pour the remainder of the dressing over it. Garnish with parsley, capers, olives, and hard-boiled eggs. If celery cannot be found, use white tender cabbage mixed with a teaspoon of extract of celery. And that's from the cookbook of Elizabeth Burt at Fort Laramie in Wyoming. I have this in our cookbook called Frying Pans West, which embodies all of the recipes from the television show series. This was put together with the historical notes and has the Burt recipes. Also one on a potato bread from Elizabeth Burt's cookbook, which is an absolutely delicious big bread. You might have seen that loaf on the table that we had there at Fort Laramie. One other thing that I wanted to show you tonight, and that is how to make Injun whiskey. You probably won't believe that this is true, but in the early days, whiskey or alcohol was so expensive to bring west. Number one, you had to run it through the government control points, smuggle it through, and then the average longevity of a man in the mountain man period in the American West was only 2 years, so you had a great number of hazards, both wild animals and Indians and accident. And to be able to bring alcohol west was quite a feat in itself. So they used to cut it. Instead of having something 100 proof, for example, they would cut it way down and put other flavorings into it to make it seem lively and tasty. And it seemed that the Indians probably had it more psychologically than physiologically. When they would drink Indian whiskey, they just knew it was fire water, and they would come alive from that. They would cut the whiskey sometimes to yield as much as 10,000% profit. Now this in a day when a gallon of whiskey could be bought for 25 cents. This was before government tax, and in those days you could literally buy a whole gallon of stuff for 25 cents. Well, they would cut the whiskey with all sorts of interesting things, such as laudanum, which was opium. At Fort Laramie, in point of fact, the American Fur Company used to spike their Indian whiskey with opium, and this, I guess, would probably put everybody to sleep in addition to the effects of the alcohol. Well, a typical recipe for spiking alcohol is to make it with gunpowder, yes, black gunpowder, red pepper, and tobacco juice. And that's the old-fashioned recipe for Indian whiskey. And to show you how this is done, I brought along a couple of little containers here. This is my Dixon powder flask that originally made in England and was down at Wagon Mound, New Mexico for many years, and I came into it. Now, to make Indian whiskey, you take corn whiskey that you can buy in any liquor store, and you cut it a little bit with water, maybe about 25% with water, and put it in a brown jug like this. Then take gunpowder, and you have to, and I want to warn you very seriously, you have to use the old-fashioned black powder, not the modern gunpowders, because the modern gunpowders are poisonous, but the old black powder is not. It was made of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, and it's not poisonous, and it gives a very nice flavor. And you add this into your jug. Then take tobacco, and you can use, as I have here, smoking tobacco, and hit it with boiling water so that you make a tea out of it. And then you can just pour it through a sieve, and you see you have a nice tea. It's also supposed to be a very fine vermifuge in case you have the problem that way. Then you can add, you really ought to do it just to taste, and add this on into your mix. And then take red pepper and put that with hot water. Make yourself this is a Green River knife, incidentally, I'm using here, which was the typical knife of the American frontier, the skinning knife. Take your red pepper, mix with water, and then very sparingly add this to taste. And I usually add about 2 teaspoons of it. This is much too much, or it would really just make smoke come out of your ears. Add these and then taste it, and taste it again, and taste it again. And that will give you real Indian whiskey, a good warmer for your cold winter evenings. The cookbook is available through your station. I want to thank you very much. Good night. I'll see you again.
This very day we went to Governor's Isle for to stand for instant cannon in true military style. 17 American dollars each month we surely get for to carry a gun and baguettes with a military step. We had a choice of going to the army or to jail, for it's up the Hudson River with the copper take the sail.